I want to start with a sound. Not a dramatic sound, not something you'd identify as the moment everything changed if you were watching it from the outside. Just laughter. My roommate's laugh. Coming from the other side of a wall I'd heard 1,000 things through in a year and a half. His alarm, his television, his phone calls with his mother on Sunday mornings. I knew the sounds of that room the way you know the sounds of anywhere you've lived long enough. This laugh was different. Not louder, not different in pitch. Different in what it was responding to. I knew it the same way you know, before anyone tells you. When someone's tone on the phone means they're talking to someone they like in a way that's specific to that person. I knew it before I understood that I knew it. I sat on the couch and listened to him laugh on the other side of the wall at something she said. And I understood not that he had been lying to me. That was the thing. The most important thing, actually. The thing I'm going to keep coming back to in this entire story. He had never said a single word that could be called a lie. He had just never said anything at all. Has anyone ever let you believe something without technically saying it and then walked away without ever being technically wrong? Tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because this story is the one I've been trying to find language for, and I think I finally have enough of it. Let me tell you how we ended up living together. His name is Seth. We found each other through one of those roommate apps, not a friend of a friend. Not someone with an existing context. Just two strangers who both needed a place and both passed each other's basic assessments of whether the other person was going to be a disaster to live with. I'm 23. He was 24 when we moved in together. 25 now. He works in sales, which sounds like a type, but he was the kind of person who made you forget the category before the sentence was finished. The first month was purely functional. We had the polite distance of people who have agreed to share a space and are still figuring out where the lines are. We learned each other's schedules. We established the coffee maker situation. We were adults about the dishes in a way that not all roommates manage, which I considered a success. By the third month, we had become more than functional. Not in any significant way, just in the way that happens when two people spend enough time in the same small apartment and enough time turns out to be enough. He was easy to talk to. That's the simplest way I can describe it. He had the quality of someone who listened to the whole sentence before he started responding. Which sounds like a low bar, but it isn't. He was also completely easy about me being gay. Not in the performed way, not the person who says that's totally cool with an energy that suggests it required them to say it. Just easy. Like it was information he had received and filed and moved on from without attaching any weight to it. I had spent enough time in the world to know that this was less common than it should be, and I appreciated it. I want to describe the first 7 months as what they were. Genuinely good. Easy in a way that living with someone rarely is. We watched things together, cooked sometimes, had the running commentary of two people who had found a comfortable rhythm. When I had a bad week, he noticed without me saying so. When he had a bad week, I noticed without him saying so. There was a kind of low-level attunement that I associated with people I'd known for years, not people I'd met through an app and shared a lease with. I was not in love with him. I want to say that clearly because I think the story is easier to dismiss. If it starts from that place, of course you got hurt. You had feelings for your straight roommate. That's a well-documented disaster. That's not what this was. Or not initially. What it was, in the first 7 months, was a good friendship between two people who happened to share a space. Then, around the 8th month, something started. I'm going to describe this carefully, because I want to be accurate. Not because accuracy produces sympathy. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for understanding, but because the whole point of what happened is in the specifics of it, and the specifics require precision. Seth started doing things that I could not read as the behavior of a person who felt nothing. Not once repeatedly, over months. Not performed, not accidental. The specific quality of it was consistent. He would initiate something that was not how two roommates moved through a space together, and then the morning would come and he would be completely normal. Not guilty, not awkward, not doing the particular version of avoiding someone that signals awareness of having done something. Just normal. Like the previous evening had been Tuesday and now it was Wednesday and Wednesday had its own requirements. I noticed. Of course I noticed. I am a person who pays attention and I was paying attention and I noticed every single time. And every single time, I explained it. The first time I told myself, he's just comfortable with me. He knows I'm gay and he doesn't feel threatened. And some straight men are like that, genuinely unbothered in the physical presence of another man, in ways that don't mean anything. The second time I told myself, this is just how we are with each other. We've built a real friendship, and sometimes friendship has a physical warmth to it, and I need to not make this into something. By the fourth or fifth time, I had stopped explaining and started something that I didn't name because naming it would have required me to make a decision about it. I had started just staying, being there, letting the thing that was happening be a thing that was happening, without forcing it into a category that would require action. And Seth, for his part, never said a word. This is the part I keep returning to when I try to understand it. He never said anything. Not I've been thinking about things. Not I don't know how to explain this. Not can we talk. Nothing. Every time was its own isolated incident. Every morning was a new day with no continuity to the previous one. The specific skill required for that, the ability to move through these months and maintain perfect day after normalcy, is something I have thought about many times since. I don't think he was doing it deliberately. That's an important distinction, and I want to hold on to it even when the holding on to it is frustrating, because I think letting go of it would make me feel better in the short term and less accurate in the long term. I think he was in a state of genuine not knowing about himself, and the way he was managing the not knowing was to not name anything, to let things happen without attaching language, to use the space of our apartment and my presence as a kind of laboratory where he could run experiments that he never wrote down. The laboratory worked out well for him. He never had to present a conclusion. He never had to submit the research. The methodology was, do the thing, don't say the thing, continue as normal. I am the person who paid the cost of that methodology. The thing about building feelings in a space where nothing has been named is that the feelings are real even though the space is provisional. I had not decided to have feelings. I had decided to stay in the ambiguity, and staying in ambiguity requires you to exist in it, and existing in something for months produces feelings the way proximity produces temperature. You absorb the warmth of a thing whether or not you've consented to be warmed. So by the time I was sitting on the couch on a Thursday evening in November, hearing Seth laugh at something a woman had said on the phone, I had 4 months of something that had never been named by either of us, and I had been carrying all of it alone, and I was only now understanding how long I had been carrying it. I sat on the couch and didn't move for a while. The laugh continued. The conversation continued. I could hear the specific texture of it even through the wall, not the words, just the frequency of exchange, the particular rhythm of two people who are interested in each other in the specific way that is different from the way you're interested in a friend. I know that rhythm. I've produced it myself. I knew what I was hearing. I thought about the 8 months. I thought about the specific calculation I had been running, the one where asking a question meant getting an answer, and getting an answer might mean the answer was no, and the answer being no would mean losing the ambiguity I had been depending on for months, because the ambiguity felt like possibility, and I had been choosing possibility over clarity since October. I thought about how long I had been waiting for Seth to say something, and I thought for the first time, clearly about the corollary to that. If I had been waiting for him to say something, it meant I had known, some part of me had known, that he wasn't going to, that the silence was the strategy, not the circumstance, that I had been waiting in a room where no one was planning to turn the light on, hoping the dark would eventually become something I could see in. The laughter from the other room was warm. That was the hardest part. Seth's laugh had always been warm. He was a warm person. None of that was fake. The warmth was real. The friendship was real. The 1.5 years we had built together was real. And also, he had been using 4 months of it to find something out about himself without telling me that was what was happening. He had been taking without asking. Not with cruelty, with the particular carelessness of someone who hadn't thought to ask because asking would have required acknowledging that there was something to ask about. Both of those things were true. I got up from the couch. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall between my room and his, which was just a wall, just drywall and paint, the ordinary boundary of a shared apartment. On the other side of it, Seth was happy. That came through even without understanding the words. I sat in my room and I thought, I have been waiting for him to say something, and he has been counting on me, not asking, and I have been the only one of us who gave something real. The night continued outside my window. The city did what cities do at night, indifferent to any of it. I sat on the edge of my bed and held the first evening in 4 months, where I let myself understand what I'd actually been doing in all the other evenings that had come before it. The morning after was a Thursday. I want to tell you about Thursday morning specifically because it's the kind of detail that sounds small and isn't. Seth was up before me. He usually was. He had an earlier start than I did, and when I came out of my room, he was in the kitchen with coffee already made, the second cup sitting on the counter the way it always sat on the counter, poured and waiting because he'd heard my alarm go off through the wall and had timed it. He said, "There's coffee." I said, "I see it." He said, "You look tired." I said, "I didn't sleep great." He said he was sorry to hear that, in the way of someone who means it and also has a schedule to keep. And 20 minutes later, he was out the door with his bag, and I was standing in the kitchen alone with the coffee he'd made for me and the wall I'd been sitting against the night before, still visible from where I was, standing. That was the morning after. That's what I mean when I say the mornings were always normal. Not forced normal, just normal. Like nothing required acknowledgement because nothing was on the record. I had been living in those mornings for 4 months, and I had let them be evidence that I was fine, that whatever was happening between us was not the kind of thing that needed to be addressed, that we had some unspoken agreement about what the evenings meant and what the mornings didn't mean. The Thursday morning in November was exactly like all the mornings before it, which was its own confirmation of something I hadn't fully articulated yet. He mentioned her name 4 days later, not as an announcement. That's what I need you to understand about how it happened. There was no sitting down. No, I need to tell you something. We were watching something on TV, which we still did, which was still a thing we did because of course it was still a thing we did because the evenings had never been named and so they continued on as evenings always had. We were watching something and a woman in it was having a conversation on the phone that was clearly a first date kind of conversation. And Seth said easy, offhand, without looking away from the screen, "Kara does that thing with her hands when she's nervous." I kept my eyes on the television. "I didn't know you knew someone named Kara," I said. "I've mentioned her." He hadn't. "We've been hanging out." That phrase. "We've been hanging out." The phrase that could mean anything and was meaning something very specific. "Since when?" I asked. He thought about it. "Couple months." I sat with that. 2 months. Which meant it had started while the evenings were still happening. Which meant they had overlapped. Not because he was doing something wrong in any legal or moral sense, nothing had been named, nothing had been promised, but because the overlap was information about what those evenings had been. They had been something he was doing on the way to something else. A parenthesis. An exploration he'd run while also pursuing the thing he was going to pursue regardless. I said, "She sounds nice." He said, "She is. She's pretty funny." He smiled at the screen. Not at me at the screen. Or at whatever he was thinking about when he smiled. "You'd like her." I think I said something after that. I think the conversation continued in the way that conversations continue when both parties are invested in it continuing normally. Which we both were, because we'd been doing that for months, and we were both practiced at it by now. I have no memory of what else was said. I just remember the specific quality of sitting on a couch I'd sat on 100 times and feeling the room be exactly the same size it had always been, and experiencing that exact sameness as the thing that was wrong. The feeling I had was not what I expected it to be. I had anticipated, in the theoretical version of this, the version I had run through in various forms on the edge of my bed, and in the shower, and in the 10 minutes before sleep, that when the concrete version arrived I would be angry. Anger made sense. Anger had a shape. Anger was the appropriate response to 4 months of something being used as a testing ground by someone who never asked your permission. What I actually felt was quieter and worse. Not grief exactly or grief, but the specific kind that arrives when something you'd been hoping was a door closes and you find out it was always a wall. The loss of a future that had never been real but had been real enough to plan around in the way the human brain plans around possibilities it's been given reasons to consider probable. Seth was still talking. About Kara. About something she'd said. About something they were going to do on the weekend. He was warm about it. He was always warm. The warmth was part of the thing. The warmth was real. Had always been real. Which made the other thing what it was. I nodded in the right places. I made the sounds that meant I was engaged. And on the inside I was doing a very quiet kind of accounting, tallying up the months and what had been in them and understanding for the first time what the sum actually added up to. I called Priya the next day. I should tell you about Priya, because she matters to this story in ways that are uncomfortable for me to describe accurately. She's 23, gay, someone I've known for 3 years through a design program we were both in before I dropped to part-time to afford the rent. She is the kind of person who sees things clearly and says the things she sees in a way that you can receive if you're ready and deflect if you're not. When I told her about Kara, She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone who is deciding what to say. Then she said, "I told you this was going to happen. You didn't know. I told you 3 times," she said, not with heat, with the flat accuracy of someone stating a fact. "The first time was in September. You told me I was reading into things. The second time was in October. You said it was different, that I didn't understand the dynamic. The third time was a few weeks ago and you changed the subject. I didn't say anything. I'm not saying I told you so," she said. "I'm really not. I'm saying I was worried about you and you weren't ready to hear it, and that's understandable, and now you're in it." I sat with that on the phone in my room with the door closed. Seth presumably somewhere else in the apartment doing whatever he was doing on a Saturday afternoon. I tried to remember all 3 conversations and found I could. I could remember exactly what she'd said, and exactly how I'd responded, and exactly the specific movement in my chest each time that I'd overridden with the explanation that she was wrong. "Why didn't you push harder?" I asked. I knew it wasn't a fair question. I asked it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. "Because you weren't going to hear it," she said. "And because it wasn't my place to force you to look at something you'd decided you weren't ready to look at. That's your call. But I said it 3 times because I thought it was important and I wanted you to know that if you needed it, the information was there. I didn't take it," I said. "No," she said. "You didn't." We talked for a while after that. She asked me how I was doing the real version of the question, not the social version, and I tried to answer it honestly, which was harder than it sounds because I was still in the process of understanding what I was feeling and putting language on it in real time while on a phone with someone who was watching me do it. What I said, after some time, was, "I don't feel the way I thought I would. I thought I'd be angry. I stopped. I feel like I gave something real and I got something unclear back. And now the unclear thing is resolving into a clear thing, and the clear thing is, it was nothing on his end. It was a way of figuring something out. And I was the space he used to figure it out, and he didn't. He didn't ask if you wanted to be that space," Priya said. "Yeah, that's the part that matters," she said. I had been telling myself, for 4 months, a version of events in which Seth was in a state of genuine not knowing, and I was keeping him company in the not knowing because that felt generous and because I had feelings, and feelings are hard to argue with. The version I told myself had us both in the dark, both figuring things out, both participants in an ambiguity that we were navigating together. What I was starting to understand, sitting in my room the day after Kara was named, was that we had not been together in the dark. Seth had been in the dark about himself. Possibly, maybe, in ways I was willing to extend him the benefit of not being sure about, but he had not been in the dark about what he was doing with me. He had been making choices about how to exist in our apartment and in our evenings that were not accidental, not unconscious, not the result of a person who doesn't understand the effect of what they're doing. You do not consistently do the same thing across 4 months without some understanding of what you're doing. He hadn't been confused about his actions. He'd been confused about their meaning for himself. And the difference between those 2 things was everything. After I got off the phone with Priya, I sat in my room for a long time. I could hear Seth moving around in the apartment in the kitchen, I thought. The specific sounds of someone making something to eat. The ordinary sounds of Saturday afternoon in an apartment I had lived in for a year and a half. I thought about what Priya had said, about the 3 conversations I hadn't been able to receive. I thought about all the ways I'd been protecting myself from the clear version of events by staying in the comfortable version, and about the specific mechanism by which I'd managed to do that for so long. The mechanism was this. Asking the question would have forced an answer. Getting an answer would have ended the ambiguity. Ending the ambiguity would have ended the possibility. And I had valued the possibility highly enough to choose not knowing over asking, month after month, protecting the maybe with everything I had. Seth had structured things so that he never had to be asked. I had stayed in the structure because the structure offered me something. Both of those things were true. I was finding that the most difficult part, not that he had done something to me, but that I had participated in the conditions under which it was possible. I heard Seth in the kitchen, a cabinet opening, water running, the completely ordinary sounds of my roommate making lunch on a Saturday. I got up. I opened my door. He was at the counter with his back to me, making a sandwich. He heard me come in and half turned and said, "Hey, you hungry?" "I'm making one anyway." He was smiling. Easy, warm, the same smile he'd been smiling for a year and a half. I looked at him standing there and felt, simultaneously and without resolution, this is the person who did this. And This is the person who made coffee for me every morning and knew what I sounded like when I hadn't slept and still knows all of that. Sure, I said. Thanks. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him make 2 sandwiches, and I thought about Priya saying that's the design, and I thought about what it meant that the design had worked so well for so long. The answer, which I was not yet ready to say out loud, was that the design had worked because I had let it, not because I was stupid or naive or incapable of seeing, but because I had wanted it to work. Because hope is a stronger currency than logic when you're spending it on something you want to be true. Seth set the sandwich in front of me. He sat down across the table. You good? He asked. Yeah, I said. He nodded and took a bite of his sandwich and started telling me about something that had happened at work that week, something minor and mildly funny. And I sat across from him and listened and thought, I have to figure out what I'm going to do with this. Figuring out what I was going to do with it took 2 weeks. Not because the decision was complicated in the way that some decisions are complicated, the weighing of outcomes, the mapping of risks. More because I needed to be sure of what I actually wanted before I did anything. Not what I wanted to feel. Not what would give me temporary relief. What I actually wanted, in the sense of what would leave me most intact on the other side of whatever conversation was coming. Priya had asked me, in one of the calls during those 2 weeks, what I was hoping to get out of talking to him. I'd said, I don't know yet. She'd said, figure that out first. So I spent 2 weeks figuring it out. I went to work. I came home. I navigated the apartment with Seth in the practiced way we'd been navigating it. The ordinary Tuesday dinners, the background television, the coffee on the counter in the mornings. Everything looked the same from the outside. From the inside, I was running a quieter process, stripping away what I would have wanted in the best-case version, some declaration, some explanation that retroactively made the 4 months into something mutual, and finding what was left underneath when the wishful thinking was gone. What was left? When I was honest, I wanted to say the true thing to the person it was about, not to hurt him, not to receive an apology that would fix something, just because I had been living in a situation where the true thing had never been said by anyone, and I was the only one carrying the cost of that, and carrying it indefinitely while saying nothing felt like a continuation of the conditions that had made the whole thing possible in the first place. I decided on a Wednesday evening, approximately 12 days after the sandwich kitchen conversation. I waited until Seth and I were both free, both home, neither of us mid something. I said, can we talk? Not about anything wrong, I just need to say something. He looked at me. He had good instincts. Seth did. It was part of what made living with him easy, and also part of what made the previous 4 months difficult to explain, because a person with good instincts who consistently doesn't name things is making a choice about not naming them. Yeah, he said. Of course, we didn't do it in the apartment. That had been my decision, made in the 2 weeks of thinking it through. The apartment had too much history in it. Every wall was associated with something. I suggested we walk. There was a park 2 blocks away, one of those small urban ones that existed more as a buffer between streets than as an actual destination. But it had a bench that was usually empty in the evenings, and I had walked through it enough times to know it was a quiet space. We walked. It was cold. November had settled into the real version of itself by then, the kind of cold that made breath visible. Neither of us said anything on the 2 blocks over. Seth had his hands in his pockets and was doing the thing he did when he was prepared for something to matter slightly more internal. The external energy dialed down to conservation mode. We sat on the bench. I looked at the small square of park rather than at him. The sparse November trees, the path light making circles on the concrete. I had planned how to start this and found, now that we were here, that the planned version was too constructed and the unconstructed version was actually clearer. I need to talk to you about what happened over the last few months, I said. Not to start something. Not to put anything on you that you don't want. Just because I think you know what I'm talking about and I need to say it out loud. He was very still beside me. Okay, he said. Something happened between us over the last 4 or 5 months, I said. It wasn't nothing. I know it wasn't nothing, because I was there and I paid attention. And it never got named. Not by you. Not by me. And I stayed in the not naming because asking would have forced an answer and I wasn't ready for the answer. But I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I think it's important to say it directly. Something happened. You started it. You also never said what it was or asked me what I thought it was. And now you're with someone, which I don't have any standing to have feelings about in the conventional sense, but which changes what the last 4 months were. I stopped. The park was very quiet. I know, Seth said. Not I don't know what you're talking about. Not I think you're misreading things. The thing I'd noticed in the coffee shop conversation with Connor weeks before this, the not denying had its own version here. Seth didn't deny. He sat on the bench in November and said, I know, in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, and that meant he had been sitting with his own version of this. What did you know? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. I watched him from the side, the profile of a person working through something in real time, deciding how honest to be. That it was something, he said. That it was, I don't know how to describe it except that I knew it wasn't nothing. But I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what it meant. Did you know it was affecting me? He looked at the ground. I think I didn't want to know that, he said. And this, too, was more honest than I expected. The specific honesty of someone admitting to a chosen ignorance. That's a difference, I said. Between not knowing and not wanting to know. Yeah, he said. I know it is. I'm not angry at you for not knowing who you are, I said. That's yours to figure out, and it's not my business. What I want you to understand is I stopped, finding the exact words. You could have said something. You could have said, I don't know what this is. I'm confused. I need time to understand this. That was a conversation we could have had. Instead, you let it continue for months without telling me that's what was happening. You used the space between us to figure something out, and you never asked me if I wanted to be used for that. He didn't say anything for a moment. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said. I know you weren't, I said. I believe that completely. But trying not to hurt someone and actually not hurting them aren't the same thing. The gap between those is where I've been living. The breath between us was visible in the cold. A couple walked past the park on the path, talking about something, not noticing us. The park continued to be a park. I'm sorry, he said. He said it simply, the way some people say things simply, when they've arrived at the place past the prepared version. I know, I said. I believe that too. We sat for a while. The silence was not hostile, it was the specific silence of two people who have said the real things and are letting them settle. There was something almost peaceful about it, which surprised me. I had expected this to feel like a confrontation, and instead it felt like a clarification, like a room where someone had finally turned on a light not to expose anything, just to make it possible to see where the furniture actually was. I have something to ask you, Seth said. After a while, I waited. Did you? He stopped. Were you in it? Like, did you have? Yes, I said. I let that be the complete answer because it was. He absorbed that. I watched him absorb it, which was its own information, the specific expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they had suspected and are now sitting with the implications of the confirmation. I'm sorry, he said again. You said that. I mean it again. We walked home mostly in silence. Not the hostile version, not the performed okayness version. Just two people who had said significant things and needed some air around them. When we got back to the apartment, he went to his room and I went to mine, and I sat on the edge of my bed, the same edge I'd been sitting on over and over in the past weeks, and waited to feel whatever I was going to feel. What arrived was not what I expected. I had expected relief, or grief, or anger, or some version of resolution that felt like a resolution. What arrived was something more complicated and more useful, which was understanding. Not understanding of him, I understood Seth as well as I was going to, but understanding of myself, of the specific mechanism by which I had gotten here. I had been waiting for him to say something. For 4 months I had been waiting in the space of the ambiguity, hoping that the ambiguity would eventually resolve itself in my direction, that if I stayed in it long enough and was present enough and didn't ask any questions that would force a concrete answer, eventually something would solidify into something I could hold. But Seth wasn't confused about his actions. He had been confused about what they meant for himself, and I had interpreted his confusion about himself as uncertainty about us. And I had stayed in the uncertainty because uncertainty felt better than the possible answer to the question I was afraid to ask. He had chosen ambiguity because it cost him nothing and gave him whatever he was looking for. I had stayed in the ambiguity because asking the real question felt more dangerous than not knowing the answer. Those were different choices with different stakes. And mine had cost me more, but mine had been choices. This was the part that was going to take longer to sit with. I lay back on my bed and looked at the ceiling and held two things at the same time. What he'd done, and what I'd done in response to what he'd done. Both were real. Neither was going to make the other one not real. My phone lit up. A text from Priya. How did it go? I looked at the message for a moment. Then I called her. She picked up on the second ring. He said sorry, I said. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it. Not the automatic version, the real version. Like sorry isn't wrong to say. And also like it doesn't quite touch the actual thing. What's the actual thing? She said. I looked at the ceiling. That I needed someone to want me clearly, I said. Not in theory. Not in ambiguity. Clearly. And I let myself believe someone did without ever asking them to say so. And that's something I did. That's mine to look at. Priya was quiet for a moment. Yeah, she said. That's the harder thing. It is, I said. We stayed on the phone while the apartment around me was quiet. Seth somewhere on the other side of the wall. The city outside doing its night things. And I held the harder thing and started, slowly, to look at it. Looking at the harder thing took longer than a phone call. It took most of December. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that disrupted my functioning or produced anything externally visible. I went to work. I came home. I did the ordinary things that constitute a life. But underneath the ordinary things there was a process running that I was trying not to rush, because I had learned something about what rushing things produced, and I wanted to do this one slowly enough to actually get to the bottom of it. The harder thing, to be clear, was this. I had known for a long time before Kara's name was said what Seth was and wasn't capable of giving me. I had known it in the way you know things when you've been paying careful attention and the evidence is in front of you, known it not as a conclusion I'd reached but as a conclusion I'd been avoiding. And the avoidance had been a choice, not an unconscious one, not a passive drift. A choice I'd made over and over, day after day, because the alternative to staying in the ambiguity was having the conversation that would end it. And I had valued having the thing, even the unclear version of the thing, more than I valued knowing the truth of what the thing was. That was mine. I didn't enjoy looking at it. But looking at it was the only way to understand it well enough to do something different. Seth and I still had 3 weeks on the lease after the park conversation. I had thought that would be harder than it was. What it actually was. Quieter, not hostile, not awkward in the way of people who are maintaining something with effort. Just different. The easiness between us had always been real, and the easiness was still there, but it existed now inside a different understanding. We both knew what had been said in the park. Neither of us pretended the saying hadn't happened. We moved through the apartment as two people who had been honest with each other, and were now figuring out what honesty meant for the space. One evening, maybe a week before my move-out date, Seth knocked on my doorframe. I was at my desk doing something on my laptop. And I looked up and he was standing there with the particular quality of someone who has decided to say something and is at the moment just before saying it. Can I come in? Yeah, I said. He sat on the edge of my desk chair, which he'd done 100 times. The easy habit of a year and a half. I've been thinking about what you said, he said. In the park. Okay. The part about not asking if you wanted to be that space for me. He was looking at the desk rather than at me. I've been thinking about that specifically. Because I think he stopped, found his way back to it. I think I knew what I was doing in the sense that I knew something was happening. But I think I was telling myself that because nothing was explicit, nothing was being asked of you, like I wasn't asking you for anything. So I wasn't taking anything. I looked at him, but that's not true, he said. I was asking you for something. I was asking you to be available. And I just didn't say it was what I was doing. So I got to pretend it wasn't. I sat with that for a moment. It was more than I'd expected from this conversation, more than I'd expected from him specifically, which was maybe unfair of me, but was honest. Yeah, I said. That's accurate. I'm sorry for that specifically, he said. Not just the general sorry I said before. That specific thing. The specific apology landed differently than the general one had. Not because it solved anything, nothing was solved. The 4 months were what they were, but because it was accurate. He had named the mechanism. And having someone name the mechanism they used meant they had understood it. And understanding it was a step toward it not happening to someone else. Thank you, I said, for actually looking at it. He nodded. He stayed for a few more minutes. We talked about the move, about logistics and timing, and then he went back to his room and I turned back to my desk and sat there for a while not doing anything on the laptop. That was the last real conversation we had in the apartment. I want to tell you about the day I moved out. Because it mattered in a way I didn't expect. The new apartment was smaller. I'd found it quickly, which was a function of necessity, and a function of having lived in the city long enough to know where to look. It was on the 4th floor of a building 2 neighborhoods over, with windows that faced east and a kitchen that was barely large enough to qualify as a kitchen and no living room to speak of, just an open area that connected to the sleeping area through the absence of a wall rather than a door. It was entirely mine. I carried things up 4 flights of stairs over the course of a Saturday. Priya came to help, which meant she carried things up 4 flights of stairs and also provided a running commentary on the boxes and their contents, and made the process take 20% longer and feel 60% better. Seth had offered to help and I'd said I was fine, which was true, and also which gave us both a clean ending to the moving out, rather than one that required us to spend several more hours in the same space performing something. By early afternoon, the boxes were in. Priya sat on the floor against the wall. There was nowhere to sit yet. Everything was in boxes and looked around the empty-ish space. "It's good," she said, not encouragingly, assessingly. "It's yours." "It's small," I said. "It's yours," she said again. She stayed for a couple of hours. We assembled the bed frame, which took longer than the instructions suggested and required us to improvise with a butter knife at one point, and ordered food to the new address, a small thing that felt significant, the address being new, the city knowing where I was now in a slightly different way, and sat on the floor eating and talking about things that weren't the last 2 months. Before she left, she asked, "How are you actually doing?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I think I'm okay. I think I'm going to be okay in the way that takes some time and isn't just a sentence." "That's a good answer," she said. "I've been learning from the mistakes that produced the question," I said. She laughed, which was the right response. After she left, I sat in the new apartment for the first time by myself. It was quiet in a way that Seth's apartment, my previous apartment, the apartment that was now just Seth's, had never been. No sounds through the walls, no coffee already made, no evidence of another person anywhere in the space. I want to say something about what that felt like, because I think the honest version of it is complicated and the simple version would be wrong. The simple version would be, it felt freeing, clean, the clarity of a space that was entirely mine and didn't contain any unresolved questions. The honest version, it felt both of those things and also a little like loss, which is the part I didn't expect. Not loss of Seth specifically, or not only, loss of the texture of a life that had included another person's presence in it, the coffee, the counter, the ambient sound of someone else existing in the adjacent room. I had been living with someone for a year and a half, and the someone was gone now, and the absence was the correct outcome of a sequence of events that I fully understood and couldn't argue with. And it was also an absence. Both of those were true at the same time. I sat in the new quiet and let it be both. I want to say something now, directly, about what I learned. There's a specific kind of situation, and I think it's more common than it gets named, where someone takes from you without having the conversation about what they're taking, not by lying, not by promising things they don't deliver. They just create the conditions. They generate warmth, presence, something that reads like intention, and they let you fill in the rest. And the filling in is yours. They didn't put anything specific on the record, and so when it ends, when the warmth redistributes itself towards something else, there's no statement they made that could be called a lie. That's the design of it. You can't be wrong on paper if you never said anything definitive. And the person on the other side of it can't accuse you of lying because you technically didn't. And somehow all the cost lands on the person who let themselves believe. What I want you to take from this is not, be guarded. That's the wrong lesson. Guardedness is the other extreme of the same problem, either staying in ambiguity because hope is more comfortable than honesty, or closing yourself off because getting hurt in an ambiguous situation convinced you that openness leads to that. The right lesson, the one I'm still learning, is ask for the clear version. You are allowed to ask what something is. You are allowed to say, I need to know what this is before I keep going. That conversation might end the thing. The thing ending when you ask is information about the thing. A person who wants to be with you clearly, without ambiguity, without needing you to stay silent about what's happening. That person will not disappear when you ask for clarity. They'll answer. I had stayed in 4 months of ambiguity, because asking the question felt more dangerous than not knowing the answer. I had prioritized the possibility, the maybe, the open door over the actual information about whether the door led anywhere. And I had done that because I was afraid, and because the comfortable thing and the honest thing were different things, and I chose comfort. That's a human thing to do. I don't think it's a character flaw, But I think it's worth seeing clearly, because you can't make a different choice next time if you don't understand the choice you made this time. If you've been here, if you've stayed in something unclear longer than you should have because asking the direct question felt like too much of a risk, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. Not because I think there's a formula that fixes it, but because I think the silence around this specific experience keeps people in it longer than they have to be. Subscribe if you're still here. I'm going to keep telling the honest version. The apartment got more livable over the following weeks. I unpacked the boxes. I got a second-hand couch from someone Priya knew. I learned which way the morning light came through the east windows and started making coffee before I was fully awake and drinking it at the window, which became the new version of a morning ritual. Seth texted sometimes. Not often. Friendly texts. Brief. The kind that two people send when they have genuine goodwill toward each other and also understand that some distance is appropriate. I texted back in the same register. It was, strange as it sounds, more honest than the year and a half had been in some ways. Nothing was implied. Nothing was ambiguous. The texts meant what they said. What I have, on the other side of all of it, is clarity. Not the easy kind, not the kind that arrives after a clean resolution where all questions are answered and everyone gets what they needed. The kind that comes from having looked at something honestly and understood your own role in it. That's a harder thing to arrive at, and it sits differently than relief does. I live in a space now where nothing is implied. Nobody is on the other side of any wall leaving things unnamed. The quiet of that took some getting used to. It still takes some getting used to. Some mornings. But I know what I'm working with. I know what the space contains. I know what I need to be true for me to stay in something. Someone who will say, out loud, what they mean. That's worth the cost of finding out I needed it.